Keith will be speaking about the reappearance of the Christ and the restoration of the mysteries. As you know, or you may know, Keith Bailey has been very active in the restoration of Masonry to its true intent. And he's the principal officer of the Ancient Universal Mysteries group, the AUM movement. So we're told by the Tibetan that Masonry is so important for the establishment of the mysteries on our planet, as well as being the seat of initiation and the custodian of the law. It's the home of the mysteries. So we look forward to what Keith has to say about this imminent process whereby the mysteries of initiation will be externalized, restored for the participation of those human beings who are ready for that. Keith, welcome.
And thanks again to the board of the USR and for Michael for inviting me to come again for the 20th year. Pardon? You were there at the beginning. Yes, one of the veterans of the very first, of the barn. Stable. Let's get it right. Okay, and thanks, Michael, for telling me what I'm going to talk about. Didn't realize it was such a lofty subject. Jeez. Anyway, I have been asked to speak about the reappearance of the Christ and restoration of the mysteries, and to mention or to bring in Masonry into it, although we're not particularly talking about what we're doing in AUM, but the idea in Masonry in general. So, I guess if we're going to talk about the restoration of the mysteries, it means that if we're going to restore something, then you can only restore something that already exists. So the very idea of restoration of the mysteries within the body of humanity means that they already exist within there, and they have existed in past ages, as we all know, and this has been a rather different time in which they have been somewhat veiled over the past several hundred years. And so in many ways, the restoration of the mysteries refers to the mysteries of being and existence. Not so much interesting information, but how that information is transmuted into an understanding of the nature of being and existence. So, on this account, there's a lot of glamour, I think, that perhaps revolves around the idea of the mysteries, and also it's caused Masonry to have somewhat of a questionable reputation because people regard it as secret and things like that. Whereas it's not so much that there's secrets, except in Masonry the form of secrecy is preserved in order to protect those mysteries from those who are ready to receive them, and from the dangers inherent to the individual. Really, the nature of understanding or the mysteries of existence should be known to everyone, providing they don't cause any harm. If they cause no harm to the individual and to the larger whole, then of course they should be duly shouted from the housetops. But some things are very dangerous, and so one has to be protected from them until one earns them by virtue of merit, earns the right. And many mysteries anyway exist on other planes in our normal mode of functioning, so they're inaccessible anyway. So it's pointless complaining about it. Masonry preserves the form of secrecy in order to, for that period when the mysteries will be truly restored. But even then, they're not something you're just told. You have to rise up to a higher level of consciousness in order to ascertain them. I guess we find that in meditation, where we have maybe a deeper insight into something, and then it's all forgotten when we return to our normal consciousness, because it resides on a higher plane of existence. So when we continually habituate such a plane, then the certain mysteries are constantly part of our normal understanding. So they form part of the normal content of the consciousness as much as our normal everyday functioning. So, this reveals then somewhat that there are two paths, really. There's the esoteric path and there's the exoteric path. The esoteric path really concerns the nature of the unfoldment of the spiritual entity, the soul, on its own plane and in its own understanding. Pardon me. This really is the fundamental tenet of all mystery schools, the evolution of the inner spiritual being. Now, for most of us, we're pursuing actually more the exoteric path, if the truth be known, because we're developing our approach from the bottom up rather than from the inside out. So there is a real difference. There's the understanding of the unfoldment of the soul on its own plane and its varying degrees of consciousness, of being and existence. And then there's our attempts on the outer plane, the exoteric path, to try to come to terms with those things that infiltrate to our consciousness from time to time, those little fleeting deep impressions, those awakenings that cause us to try to shape and mold ourselves to be a more fitting instrument for the spirit aspect. The occultist ever works with the shaping and molding the environment from the inside out. He works upon a knowledge and understanding of the plan and shapes and molds the environment, the form nature, to be a fitting instrument for the expression of the spirit aspect. That's the work in most simplest kind of form. The work, obviously, to the inner being, as seen, is far more simple, perhaps, than we ever make it, because it's more decisive and definite and clearer to the consciousness. There's no duality involved. The reappearance of the Christ, on the other hand, if I'm talking to both of these things, which we are, this is what this conference is all about, in many ways, we can talk about it from another angle, not only the coming avatar, of which so much has been said, which is also true and wonderful, but also from the angle as it's depicted in all of us through the emerging world religion in the symbolism or the factual nature of the solar angels overshadowing the soul within us from the inner point of view. From the inner point of view, that universal Christianity already exists within us, remains to be brought to the surface. It's all in the understanding of the solar angels who bring to us that cosmic love from a much higher sphere. They are the Christ within, perhaps even from the cosmic astral plane, it can be said they bring it forth. They overshadow the souls from the Buddhic level, because that's the lowest they can descend. They spark the souls into ignition, and then the souls, through the nature of the mind, become the mediating ones and learn to become masters. The solar angel can be seen somewhat as the master workman, and the souls as the entered apprentices learning how to master the lower three planes. So the myth is there and has ever been there in Masonry, because the myth in Masonry really, or the dramatization, is that of the indwelling Christ aspect and and the evolution of that Christ aspect within. It deals with the evolution of the consciousness of that Christ aspect within as it masters various phases of existence and being and matter and substance, and raises them to the level, to states of its own nature. Every soul incarnates under the law of sacrifice and service, not of agony and death. In spite of all appearances, there is another way. Every soul, all of us here, from the soul angle, have reincarnated under the law of sacrifice and service. And every soul has, for its purposes, in every incarnation, progress, in spite of what things appear. Even if it's a life of woe and misery and suffering, to the soul it's a life of liberation and release, because it gets things out of the way for future lives of greater acceleration. And anyway, it's all the accumulations of past karma anyway. There can't be any other. It's all of our own making, and so there we have to face the music. So every soul comes into incarnation under this law of sacrifice and service to lift and raise the lesser lives unto the condition and states of its own divine nature. This is the Christ within, you see, lifting and aiding the little ones, the lunar lords of our three bodies. We have three lunar lords we're dealing with the mental, astral, and physical body, and then a big lunar lord we call the personality, which eventually becomes a dweller stalking the earth. And the soul seeks to fuse and blend and absorb these all into its own nature and lift them all to the states of its own divine nature. This is the sacrificing of its nature to make sacred and to raise states of matter to approximate states of consciousness. So there's this universal story of the indwelling, overshadowing Christ, just like the Christ overshadowing Jesus, that exists within each and every one of us, because the solar Lord, the solar angel, overshadows our very soul, the Master Jesus within, or the entered apprentice, the little craftsman, you see, and trains him, as it were. They are one, because overshadowing is at one. There's no distinction. You can't be overshadowed and not be at one with that which overshadows you. So, the at-one-ment is complete, and so both think and act as one. So you see, Jesus was like the personality of the Christ, this perfected initiate, just in the same way that our personality from the soul angle, if seen properly through the sun sign, is like the pledged disciple that it has within the earth. The rising sign being the soul indicator of the soul qualities for that life, and the sun sign being the lessest luminary within the world. And if seen from, if on the path of discipleship, it can be seen as the pledged disciple with all the qualities and attributes that one would bring to service within the world through the sun sign. Focus through it like a focused a lens, as it were. Now the two have to become blended and fused. So, many marvelous things have been said. Michael mentioned lots of very important key points in both of his earlier talks about the reappearance of the Christ and the world religion and everything else. So there's no need to repeat them, but all of those points are worthy of picking up, really, for deep conferencing and discussion. They're all so important. So we have these two paths, the esoteric and the exoteric, and we have to blend the two. The exoteric path has to be, we have to learn more to govern it from the esoteric angle. Quite often our speculation is from the bottom up, and our view tends to come from the outside looking up rather than from the inside looking out. So we still have lots of work to do in that area, and most of our review, quite often a look at the world, is seeing marvelous things happening and being glad about it and being dimly aware that there is a plan taking place and that hopefully these things will happen anyway before doom descends upon us. But not always are they seen in the greatest light of the esoteric view. And being as we study all this material, we have an obligation to develop that view. All of it is important. You have to do it all. Meditation, you have to study, you have to become a profound esoteric student. You have to know everything you can about every intimate subject of the constitution of man, the rays, astrology, everything else. And you have to be the conscious, developing mystic, excelling in terms of consciousness achievement and penetrating into the light. But it's pointless penetrating into the light if you have no scaffolding upon which to erect properly the understanding of that which is seen. Otherwise, just because it must be built upon the path of reason, which Carl showed at the end, the path of, or someone did anyway, that we call it love, but the hierarchy called it the path of the same energy, the path of reason, really. So all of our developing consciousness must be along that path. We must try to, otherwise we can't imagine that just because we think something is necessarily true and correct. It may be true and correct for us, but it doesn't mean that it's absolutely true. So the path of reason helps us to make those discriminative analysis in the light of something deeper by virtue of spiritual debate with ourselves and verification, and whereby we repeat the experiment. You can't just see something once and believe it. You've got to be able to do it any time at will and bring it on, baby. Any time one must be able to prove the factual nature of the real revelations. One must be able to call it to mind and be able to bring about those, invoke that same factor again and again repeatedly via the same technique. And then you have a proven technique substantiated by a valid proof and reason. So don't believe everything you think, and don't believe everything you hear, including what I'm saying here. Most part, I have loads of notes here, I'm just making it up. Which is what I always do. I just make it all up as I go along. You have to if you work with Michael, because you never get any he never gives me a score or anything to play music. He said, we'll do this, it's on the presents, okay? Okay, got it. Yeah. Cool. So, spontaneity is the key, and that's the way of the ashramic mode anyway. So, we have many ashramic moments here, indeed, don't we? Spontaneous ashramic moments. Now, we're told the plan for man has three great goals: the evocation of the will, the illumination of the mind, and the revelation of love. It's that simple. On paper. But we don't often think of the will as being evoked. We think it's something we have to do, get a hold of and then do. So, throughout the rest of this, I'll touch upon those points without mentioning them. I just mention them here because if we align ourselves along this triple line of force, the evocation of the will, the illumination of the mind, and the revelation of love, and if we bear that in mind every day, then we can link our consciousness and our activities with the plan in motion. Because it is in motion, it's not static. We tend to fix it in our consciousness and remain undeveloped. There is a fixed design, but that's somewhat really quite different. The soul has that in mind, and it seeks to absorb all of its instrument of experiment to vibrate eventually with that fixed design. That fixed design is something spiritual. Now, Masonry has been said by DK to be the custodian of the law, the home of the mysteries, and the seat of initiation. These are big words. In AUM, that's been our fundamental keynotes around which to build this whole thing. And we've spent years and years, on each one fathoming the way through. It's a big thing. They're big words. The home of the mysteries. I mean, we're told about the restoration of the mysteries, and we're told Masonry is the home of the mysteries. Now, I won't say why. It's just all secret. It's so secret, we're still trying to figure it out. But in what I have to say, maybe some of this will begin to unfold throughout the rest of this little talk. The home of the mysteries and the seat of initiation. These constitute much of our Masonic study, these two things. They are, as I mentioned, that Masonic rituals dramatize the evolving Christ life within as it passes from stage to stage through the degree ceremonies, which are symbolic of the initiations. And in Masonry, as it exists anyway, all over the world, it's very jumbled and it's all mixed up, and a lot of the symbolism is all convoluted, and there's a lot of moving forward and backstepping, all kind of stuff like that. So what we've been doing is bringing it all into order so that the degrees correspond accurately to the actual initiation, 1 to 5, in the craft lodge anyway, and so that we make some sense out of all of this and bring it all into line, with the intended new way of teaching. Plus, pardon me, I've had to recompose all the rituals in the light of all the teaching and to make it more universal, you see, and gradually wean all of the Jewish emphasis out of it. But it was all marvelous what they did. It's quite incredible, actually. What they put into it, they must have been truly wise seers. It's all there. All the mysteries of all the stuff the DK says, it's all there. Right. So we got these points, and to constantly bear in mind the universal Christianity already exists within us. The myth already exists. The overshadowing solar angel, the Christ consciousness within. The universal Christ exists within each and every one of us already, overshadowing our soul and fostering all along the path of love, what we call love anyway, which essentially they bring to us an energy from beyond the cosmic physical plane. They bring to us this cosmic energy from the cosmic astral plane, which we call love, which is in reality a reflexive energy. Because the highest aspect that we can develop in man is the spiritual will, about which we're told will characterize the teaching of the New Age and what the Christ will make clearer. But this highest aspect in us, the spiritual will, is apparently the lowest manifestation of this cosmic astral energy we call love. It relates to will and desire. This is cosmic desire reflecting in our cosmic physical plane through the aspect we call spiritual will. And just as within us desire and will are two polarities of a single energy, we have the personal will of the individual, which must be made at one with the divine spiritual will of the soul. Then we have this other higher aspect, which is almost seemingly a reverse situation, but not really. So that it comes that when we say, Father, not my will, but thine be done, it means in reality that we are subjugating our personal will, which expresses through desire, for the highest spiritual will, so that our whole being and mode of existence is at one with the divine desire of the Logos. About God's will, we can't say a thing. It's completely beyond any effort of penetration. But about God's desire, we can grasp something, or we can come to understand something when we develop and unfold within us and evoke the spiritual will within us. So these are perhaps points of clarity that need bearing in mind when we use incredibly lofty words for things at times, and perhaps we need to have some humility in the face of it all, because there is no end to it, thank goodness. And also a sense of perspective is needed and a right sense of proportion and adjustment in our understanding at times. So, in the approach we've had to, in Masonry, we've had to thresh out a lot of our understanding, because it's a very first-rate type of energy, Masonry. It deals mainly with rays 1, 4, and 7. There's a whole bunch of us doing this who are more from the second ray line, because we have to bring out the teaching within Masonry and help make it clearer. So the investigation of the nature of the will has been one of our ongoing investigations for many, many years. And it should be, because it's our, we have to cooperate with the plan, and that's that's part of the inflowing of energy, and so it's our job to understand it. if we're going to be disciples. Just as it's our duty bound, as if we are a disciple, to extend the teaching of the 7 rays into the world. If we've read about it and we understand that, and if we are a disciple, we are bound to do this. We don't have a choice. Well, you do, but might delay things, not only on behalf of the plan, but ourselves, because we heard and listened and did not act. So Michael has been at work for years, and successfully, making people aware of the 7 rays in all kinds of ways, some humorous and some dressing up in rays and stuff like that, and in other ways of devising all these methods, which have all been so valuable to the overall scheme of things. And Marianne gave us all these marvelous statistics the other day to show that there has been tremendous response over the past 20 years, relatively. And so I remember Michael and I going for a walk years ago in downtown Manhattan, and we were talking about, we have to extend the nature of the rays. You have to do that. There's a cosmic avatar apparently waiting for us to do that as well. And he can't come any nearer until people know more about the nature of the rays. So the Uni of the 7 Rays and the Institute have been at work on this for ages. Just the name you see being out there makes people ask, what are the 7 rays? So that's propaganda. And the same, we've been at work in Masonry with the same thing. Adapting Masonry to the whole nature of the 7-ray teaching, because it's already there. It just needed to be brought out and rearranged so that it was much clearer, and it brings out the spiritual meaning of it all. So another factor in all that is the nature of the will, and in Masonry that's a big factor because it's there all the time. It's so present in every part of the work. So we've had to investigate it and ask ourselves, what should be the basic attitude of the would-be initiate, being as the whole nature of Masonry is concerned with trying to understand more about the mysteries of being and the nature of initiation and existence and everything else. And we're told it's one of purpose, governed by pure reason, and working out in spiritual activity. That, we are told, should be the basic attitude of the would-be initiate. One of purpose, governed by pure reason, and working out in spiritual activity. Now, so the attitude of the initiate in training, first of all, is right spiritual motive. This is spiritual motive. It's not necessarily our personal one, or what we would like to think is our personal one, hidden behind platitudes or other stuff. It's what actually the lords of karma look at, in case we have any doubt, or in case we think we can fool ourselves. They don't miss a thing. So they'll get it, and so will we. We'll get our due, of that we can be sure. So the motive being the intelligent fulfillment of the will aspect of divinity or of the monad. And this involves the merging of the personal self-will into that of the sacrificial will of the soul. And that sacrificial will of the soul can be likened to that same impulse that caused our souls to incarnate, to lift and aid the little ones and to raise the dead to life, basically. To lift the little ones unto the status of itself, the lives that compose our own being. We're quite a bunch, walking around. We carry around with us quite an entourage. As well as the self-made astral rabble that probably accompanies us everywhere, there's also a lot of this stuff that is actually goes into the performing as our bodies, and these are all elemental lives. You've got an elemental inhabiting each of the 3 lunar lords of the 3 bodies, which eventually becomes a deva, apparently, when we're good. And so we lift and raise that one. Then there's the big elemental called the personality, who becomes the stalking dweller of the earth. And that has to be fused and blended with the soul. They become absorbed and at one. It's not killed. That would be black magic. It's absorbed and blended. They become as one. The dweller is the entire sum total, not some little bit and piece. It's the entire sum total. Anyway, when this is accomplished, It leads to the revelation of divine purpose. And apparently only the initiate has any comprehension of what this means. Now, it also means then the release of the faculty of spiritual perception and intuitive understanding, which involves the negation of the activity of the lower mind. Can we do that for even a second? Negate the activity of the lower mind. If we even know when we're thinking, might be hard sometimes to distinguish a thought from a feeling, and they might be all wrapped up together. But anyway, we have to negate the activity of the lower mind, and we have to negate the activity of the lower personal self and the subordination of the knowledge aspect of the soul to the clear, pure light of the divine understanding. These are all to do with the attitudes of the would-be initiate, not the one who's actually it. Negation of the activity of the lower mind. Now, it means the release. That's a thought, isn't it? The release of the faculty of spiritual perception and intuitive understanding, which involves the negation of the lower mind. Then, when these two factors are beginning to be active, that is, the spiritual motive and the release of the faculty of spiritual perception, then we have the emergence of spiritual activity on the physical plane. Right doing comes from right being, really. So, we shouldn't wait until we are right being, because we'll learn and also in the doing. So, and sometimes, there come lives like this one where you just have to give up some of those spiritual goals and serve, because a lot more spiritual progress can be made in service than a life of meditation. And this is one of the lives when we just have to do that because the situation is very critical. And we're told this is the generation, these two, here we are, we were the babies when DK said that, in whose hands lies the final decision of humanity, which way it will go. The finality of the decision humanity will be forced to have to make. And here we are now approaching our first Saturn return. Some the second, maybe some the third even. And so it lies in our hands. What have we made of it? We have to ask ourselves. Anyway, these are very important things because we forget sometimes our time in space, and this time in space is when we just are called to service of a strenuous nature because of the world need, rather than, and our spiritual pursuits, we have to marry them to it, but we have to do it all and marry both. We can't do one without the other at our stage, otherwise we shouldn't be here really. We're students of the teaching, so we have to make all that practical. Enough has been said about that. But anyway, when these two factors are beginning to be active, then we have the emergence of spiritual activity on the physical plane, motivated from the monad and implemented by the pure reason of the soul and the intuition, true intuition. So these formulas of approach are to phases of the path and not to the initiator itself. They are to phases of existence and of being. That is, we can serve the Christ best, not through devotion to Him, but by virtue of our identification with His goals, His plans, His purposes. You see, it doesn't have to do with our relationship to it. Our success doesn't depend on our relationship to Him, but on our identification with Him and His goals and objectives. And that's a very different view if taken in and pondered upon deeply. So, these formulas of approach then, we have to all become penetrating points of light, you see, into something deeper. And then having grasped the vision of that, we have to seek ways and modes of implementing it. So this then we stand as an aspirant to the greater mysteries, looking into it. And the bewilderment here in this kind of view perhaps comes between the difference between the progressive evolution of the personality towards the soul, which we're so accustomed to, and the soul consciousness, and the nature of the progress which lies ahead of all of us, and is so different to the unfoldment of pure consciousness. Because we're told the higher phase of existence after the third of initiation has nothing to do with awareness or expansion of consciousness whatsoever. It doesn't have to do with that anymore. We deal then with facts not related to consciousness, and therefore, because they're not related to consciousness, we have no words for them in our three worlds, which is a world of consciousness. Because language is built upon awareness, and having no awareness of them, we cannot formulate them into language. And after the third degree then, the initiate is not concerned with consciousness at all, but with the fusion of the individual will with the divine will. And such a one is not occupied then with increasing his sensitivity to contact, to the environment, or to conscious response to the environmental conditions. So this tells us then that the spiritual will, after all, eventually replaces consciousness as we know it. It's a whole other phase of being. It cannot be grasped with the consciousness, except theoretically, to build the scaffolding towards eventually becoming it. But it has to do with the will to be, not the will to do or the will to see, but the will to be. So we might commit that thought much deeper. The spiritual will then, about which I earlier spoke in relation to this lowest expression of cosmic love, as it were, but the highest expression for us, has nothing to do with awareness or consciousness as we know it, and replaces consciousness. It replaces consciousness in our mode of being, our mode of existence, in our mode of perception. So you see, it's far more abstract. At being at one with the cosmic desire of the Logos, being at one with his desire of for the nations, you see. That Christ has been called the desire of the nations. So, what is such a being then concerned with? If it's not with consciousness and it's not with all these things we usually grapple with, climbing up the ladder, it's coming from the inside out. But such a being is concerned solely almost with the nature and the dynamics of the science of the service of the plan. So that gives us a whole different view of service from the view of the initiate of the third degree. The dynamics, that means it's a self-generative process. It's not something that comes from the outside, it comes from the inside out. Because such a consciousness lives on the inside and approaches the world from the inside out. So this distinctive realization then can only come about when the fused and blended personality will expression has disappeared. The personality soul expression of will has disappeared in the blazing light of soul purpose. So one has to first come through the fusion of the soul and personality will, and then something greater even takes over from that. So these formulas of understanding express this life more abundantly about which we've heard, and relates to contact with Shambhala in the New Age and not just the hierarchy. And here then the process of invocation and evocation is really important to understand, because the lesser aspect is always the invoking agent. This is unalterable. The lesser invokes the higher. And this is necessarily reciprocal, providing our invocations arrive at the right place. So be careful what you invoke, because if it doesn't reach the goal, you might get an imposter. You might get someone, towards the being. You might be directing your invocation towards a being, but if some aspect or some quality, and if the nature and quality of that, to be successful in the invocative rite, one has to have already within oneself some reciprocal quality of the nature and being towards that which one invokes. It must already be present. If one invokes the divine will, one must have that already present within oneself. One must have reciprocity in nature and in quality. And then there's a reciprocal flow set up. So this is very important then when we think of invoking the nature of the Christ, even though we must have those qualities of existence within us to gain any response, to evoke any response. Now, if we don't, if we're insincere, if our line is not clear, if we think some spook on the astral plane is some master parodying as one, and we believe it, and we fool ourselves, we can invoke that day after day to come and tell us all kinds of rubbish. And then we can go and, charge $25 a reading. Set up shop in Boulder or somewhere, and rake in the business. And then $100, for Santa Kumara and all that. So beware of the spooks on the astral plane. There's loads of them. Where he's, higher up, costs more. So beware, so there must be that, it's called the presentation of similarities, to invoke the divine will or the divine nature of being, or any being actually. One has to have already within oneself reciprocal qualities to the being invoked, the presentation of similarities. Now, the will, therefore, is the scientific application of a peculiar energy whose qualities are synthesis, power to detach from limitation, the destruction of boundaries, or, as it is called in esotericism, the ability to perforate the ring-pass knot of the blended soul and form and release the spirit into larger life. The nature of the world. You want that again? Yes. Goody. This is what is called in esotericism. The ability to perforate the ring-pass knot of the blended soul and form and release the spirit into larger life. It is a liberating, freeing energy, the nature of the will. This teaching the Christ will make clear. It is therefore a dynamic scientific application of energy in order to effect liberation from limitation. It is the will to be and not the will to do or the will to see, because both of those are aspects of the soul and the form. The will to be. It is a definite type of energy and the highest present in our planetary life. Now, in closing, a solemn note. It is, and I'm sorry I don't have pictures of dogs and things to show you. It was marvelous, wasn't it? Now, we've heard many wonderful things being mentioned by a lot of speakers, that lift and aid us and show us all the marvelous things going on in the world. And Michael has spoken admirably about the precepts of the Christ, and when he did, he invoked the presence because he used those words. But don't imagine that humanity can go on forever without mending its ways. And I found recently, in an edition of Problems of Humanity, the early edition that was published in 1946, which I happen to have and which is no longer available, there was a passage in there that dealt with the problems of humanity, and then after it, DK says, if we don't deal with these, and if a solution is not found within the next 25 years after that, after 1946, the alternative would be another war. These things are on the horizon. There's an energy war going on. That's why you get yourself, invaded. And also there's a fermenting religious war, which is all below the surface of our antenna because we don't move in that realm. We also, have at times esoteric fundamentalists as well. So we have to clean house too, Christ's own household. So we all have to shape up. But I'll read you what it said in there, because it is a bit of a jaw dropper. Or as we say in England, a gobsmacker. He says, if no progress is made and these problems remain unsolved, at least in some measure, and if humanity slips back into the status existing prior to the war, then nothing can stop the next war. Bear this in mind with the finality of the decision he mentioned in Ray's initiation, I think, at the end. And if it comes, it will bring the final death blow to the human race. Mankind as we know it could not survive, nor would it be right and good that it should. The death of a race then might be decreed, and the long process of nurturing a race of men who would finally express divinity would have to be started all over again. These are not idle words. This is DK, not me. Sorry. Humanity must take those steps to make it an impossibility. This will have to be done by the simple method of establishing right human relations between men and between nations. So, let us go to it. We have time. This opening till 2025, from 1966 to 2025, is called it's an open door to initiation, apparently. It's ingathering, like there was at the time of the Buddha. And then things will hopefully stabilize if we make the right decision now and if we offset these potentialities. They're not, he said a lot more about it. I won't say it here. It's too scary. But let's go forth and realize that it's not all over yet, It's not finished yet. There's rubbish fermenting. It's a very dangerous situation. The situation that now exists in spite of all the beauty that is happening and the things that we've been made aware of. Let's realize, let's not take anything for granted. Let's not take ourselves for granted. Let's not take all of us in the spiritual groups for granted. And don't think ourselves as so great, because part of the problem is lays at our doorstep because we haven't done enough to promote right human relations between spiritual groups. They've all been fighting for the past whatever. There's been too much competition, aggro, ambition, stuff like that, and all that must now cease. There has to be the fusion between all the spiritual groups to work together because we are the embryonic model of the new civilization and world culture. And if we can't do it, what hope for humanity? We are told it's all over. We have to start all over again. So let us do this for Christ's sake and to the glory of his name.